Okay, we're here again on Sunday with Wanda Lindstom. Is that your name? Is that your true correct name?
Yes, Wanda Lindstom
And you reside where?
in Utah, Salt Lake City, Utah.
In Salt Lake City, Utah. And is the testimony and the statement you're about to make given of your own free will, without pay, without remuneration, and without spurious reasons?
Yes,
And do you agree to let this be published on television or by radio or any other media form?
yes I do.
And do you have any hidden agendas that you're trying to use this to accomplish something that's not
None
obvious?
other than to tell the truth and to make sure that, hopefully, that the truth will get out and that people will understand that this is going on.
And are you giving the whole truth and nothing but the full truth, so help you?
Yes, I am.
Okay, go ahead with your
People
story.
can make up this stuff.
This is pretty
It's got to
good.
be true. It's too crazy not to be true. Okay, we're talking about my sister Dawn, and something that I needed to mention was that not only did my parents send Dawn back to the Catholic convent because a bishop told them to send her to a Catholic convent, which makes no sense when there's all kinds of foster programs in the Mormon church.
A Mormon bishop told her to
A
send her.
Mormon bishop told my parents, told my mother to send Dawn, who was constantly running away after the temple incident, and talking, apparently. They couldn't keep her quiet, and so they sent her to a Catholic convent about 4 hours away. Now, one thing that Dawn mentioned to me before I went to see Kathy O'Brien and Mark Phillips was a crazy story about how while she was in the military at this Hollywood base where there was a lot of drugs, the gentleman asked her to mule drugs, and she said that he was basically a person that was in the military, used by the military, but he was mafia, and that his assistant was the person we know as, don't it make your brown eyes blue, that girl? Crystal Gale.
What year was this and what base do you think it was?
I'll have to have Dawn tell you which base is the Hollywood base, but she said that there were people that came out of that were entertainers today, people we know, Richard Gere, Irene Cara, a bunch of others. And she said during this base, this gentleman contacted her while on base, left a message on the military board, and when she says, "How come you know so much about me?" she said the thing he was reading hit the floor, and he looked on the thing. And while she was in horror picking up all of these pages, she realized that there wasn't just a dossier on her and her whole life, complete with a picture, a recent picture of her, but that there was a picture of every single member of her family. There was a picture of me, Wanda, there was a picture of April, there was a picture of Irene, her, Dawn, Priscilla, Roberta, Valiant, all of the members of the family, she said, were there in that dossier. And when that all got put back together, she said, "How come you know so much about me, and how come you've got members of my family?" He just said, "Oh, well, you were sold to us by your dad." And that it would be David Hugh Cummings, that would tie him into Project Paperclip, who, because he was there at Aberdeen Proving Ground in 1946, the year after all of those scientists came over from Germany, the year that they started the mind control programming, which led to the CIA's MK Ultra, and which was exposed publicly in 1970, and under that we learned about Project Monarch. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that, and you can understand why David H. Cummings, from the Scottish lineage, the Scottish Rite genealogy that goes back to extreme religious abuse and governmental generational abuse, incest, because he was incested by his mother and abused terribly by his father and left alone, and I told you about that. And my mother would have been the perfect candidates. The remainder of the article about Project Monarch said that they would give sensory deprivation, and it was an excellent method for traumatizing a child. They would deprive a child of sight, smell, taste, touch, and hearing in a frightening place like a casket, and abusers could count on rapid dissociation. Why would the government embark upon such a program in which perpetrators would intentionally torture children? It's the first question anyone would ask. What would they get out of this? Why would they do such a thing? Well, they apparently wanted to create a person with multiple personalities that they could train each of the personalities to do specific tasks for the government or the church or whoever. The result is a person who, when properly cued or triggered or given in the LDS genre, they would call it the secret combinations. They would be cued and triggered, and they would have an altar come out and perform a certain job. Now this went along with Kathy O'Brien's story, that she would be given a cue, a trigger that would be sexual, and that she would deliver a message in the same inflection as the person who gave her the message. She would go from Manuel Noriega's camp, and in his inflection give the person that she was supposed to deliver the message to, that person would untrigger her, choose whatever sexual programming she had to deliver, take advantage of her sexually, and then she would just simply leave, and she wouldn't even have any idea what she just did. That is why they would do these kinds of things and getting out a dissociative personality. The result is a person who, when properly cued or triggered, would have an altar come out and perform a certain job. When the job was over, the government abuser, also called a handler, would call out another altar who would remember nothing of what the other altar had done. In other words, the perfect spy. Now, April's story is that we were used in the late 60s and in the early 70s as children's spies, and that we were programmed for, chosen for a special program at Vandenberg Air Force Base, that we were taught all kinds of things, like how to fly an airplane, many different languages, and I mean, her story is pretty incredible.
Did you ever witness April flying an airplane?
No, but I personally flew an airplane for my brother-in-law, who is a pilot. He told me that I could land the plane, and with very little instruction, with hardly any instruction at all, I landed it, and he said if I didn't know any better, I'd swear you've done that 1,000 times before. And I just remember at the time, this is way too easy. It's like driving a car. It was very strange for me at the time. Then later April tells me that we were little children that had been programmed to do all these things. And it wasn't hard for me personally to believe it because of my personal experience with that one thing. When the child grew up, he or she would be programmed to the point where a specific altar could be cued to carry out certain orders. Then if that altar were ever captured, another altar would immediately take over, having no memory of the government mission. The spy could be tortured and never reveal any secrets. What better kind of thing than children or young people to be put into these kinds of positions? One thing that April and I were involved in early was a group under the direction of Glenn Montague that went behind the Iron Curtain at the time to a very strange little country called Romania, with a guy named Ceausescu, who we know at this time is one of the most evil people on the planet. And April and I went through all kinds of different cities in Romania at that time, and April has memories that were delivering secrets from our government. This was put together through something through the Reader's Digest, and Glenn Montague, who is also, according to April, a handler, and was involved in teaching us certain kinds of coded things, and he worked for the government on this mission. And when we were very young, I was 17 and April, I was 17 and 18, and April was 16 and 17, and we were working apparently. And then right after that we went to BYU, and none other than Gerald Ford, who both Kathy O'Brien and Sue Ford mentioned did come, and we personally welcomed President Ford, who was then Vice President Ford, to BYU. Nixon was supposed to be there, but Ford came instead. And if the story is correct, Ford, at the time Kathy O'Brien grew up, she didn't know him as a presidential candidate or as anything political. She only knew him as her abuser, as the person who was directly over her father, who delivered pornography. Now when you add my father into this, who was probably delivering pornography through all the schools, the school system, both as a teacher and as a fundraising director for schools, you've got a pattern here. You've got the pattern of Kathy O'Brien talking about President Ford as the person that was giving and directing the flood of pornography and all the way through the United States. The thought that my father might be involved in that is an absolute fact because of Roberta's testimony. The fact that he would be involved in President Ford's little pornography ring in the 60s and early 70s is not hard to believe at all when these testimonies have come out by these other completely separate testimonies. And Sue Ford, who wrote a book called Thanks for the Memories, who was an ex-beauty queen who worked under the direction of Bob Hope, states that through the military system, she worked with Bob Hope in getting drugs and pornography smuggled through all of the people all over the world in the military.
Are you saying Bob Hope knew about the pornography, knew about the
Bob
drugs?
Hope was a part of it, as she worked for Bob Hope during this whole time, and Bob Hope, Henry Kissinger. Sue Ford is somebody that I've been emailing with, and she wrote a book. It's out. It's called Thanks for the Memories, and she goes into great details over how Bob Hope was a part of all of this. And she names names just like Kathy O'Brien. Kathy O'Brien names Bill Clinton, and she goes into great detail about Mena, Arkansas, and his drug operation
Hillary
there.
Clinton.
She goes into great detail about how he was bisexual. She goes into detail, she personally had sex with him. She says that mostly he was having sex with men, and that Hillary Clinton was the one she mostly had sex with. And again, it was this triggering that was done. And I know that is a disgusting story, but that is what she said, and it goes right along with April and I at BYU. And the something called, believe it or not, flag-waving sounds of freedom. And, you know, when I think of the flag-waving campaign that's going on right now, it makes me sick to think that these very people, President Bush, the Bush people, Bill Clinton, who back in 1986 was told that he would be, she overheard a conversation that he was supposed to be the next president after the Bushes took over. These things are planned far in advance, she says, and what we think is a real election is just a big joke because both sides are completely decided upon, and it's all way planned in advance for this new world order to come into play. Back to the MK Ultra. This sounds preposterous, but it also makes sense. The following facts were cited. 71% of the victims were female because females tended to dissociate easier than boys. 100% of the victims had multiple personality disorder, set in perfect place by the generational incest worked out through the ritual. So the government would come in behind the ritual, and it was perfect for them. All monarch survivors were victims of brutal sexual child abuse or multi-generational incest victims whose genealogy could be traced to a religious group and or members of the U.S. intelligence communities. April and I, for some reason, when we were 14 and 15 years old, it was very important for us to put our genealogy together. Remember, April?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that interesting?
They have the
that
church
we did
do
that,
it.
that
Do
the
it.
church incited us to do that, or somebody incited us to do our genealogy. Think about our genealogy. I mean, that's so unusual for children to be involved in genealogy back then. Now it's more prevalent, but to think that the church is using these genealogical records to find out who was related to who, etc., and to be
That they're
using
tracking
the
them.
DNA and all the genealogy, not necessarily for what we're being taught and told that the genealogy would be used for. How did the government know who was a multi-generational abuse victim? Soldiers entering the military took psychological tests specifically designed to show who would be a good candidate. My father entered the service right out of high school, and so did my father, and I'm reading this from this book. His first assignment was Korea in the late 40s, just as the Cold War was beginning. I had already suspected my father had been abused, and his misogynistic tendencies fit right into the description for his program. But how did they get a soldier to turn over his child to such a program? There were several ways. Brainwashing became a term related to Korea in the late 40s. Some soldiers could have been experiments themselves for mind control. Others were blackmailed. Kathy O'Brien states that her father was blackmailed because of pornography. He could have gone to jail or just put his children into the program. With my father, he was originally all the way through college. He was originally in the military and through college. If he had a tendency toward this kind of thing, if they were caught with any kind of thing involving pornography or child pornography, in my father's case, then they would have been immediately inducted. Or through the psychological test, they could have figured out that my father was multi-generational incest, and they could have easily figured out that he had a strange problem. Now she goes on to tell about her father. She said others were blackmailed. The article gave the example of military personnel sending pornography through the mail. With what my father had done to me, it was hard to imagine he had engaged in this activity. It wasn't hard to imagine, she said. The same with us. It's not hard for us to believe at all, is it? Mm-hmm. The government stepped in and pretty much said, turn over your child to us or we'll turn you in. So they set these poor people up. I mean, they're poor because they're incest victims. It was done to them. They had no way of getting out. I worked out of the prison and I was horrified when they told me, oh, don't worry about it. They're just the they're just the child molesters. They're the nicest people at the prison. It's just low, security. Don't worry about it. And as I got to know some of these people, I found out, yeah, they were the nicest people. And as I've gotten to know my father as an adult child, if you were to meet my father, you would find him engaging, delightful, and the personality that he shows to the world that isn't the sick person, you would never guess. That brings me to the next part of my story. When my sister Andrea, who was living with me at the time, was going through therapy, and she said, Wanda, I'm going to tell all. I'm going to get in front of my dad. I'm going to explain to him. Would you go with me? This was hard. She decided to come over and sit me down. My mom was sitting in the couch, and my dad was sitting in the couch. They were sitting next to each other. My dad was getting real nervous, and Andrea said, Dad, I want to talk to you, and I don't want to pull any punches. She said, I want to tell you that I remember what you did to me in the shower. I remember that you did it to me and Don for years. And she, in front of my mother, told that my dad had forced her to touch his penis at a young age, to do certain things with it, and that every time he would go into the shower, he would bring Dawn and Andrea in there and do the same thing over and over again, and it involved oral sex. And my mother was crying and saying, why would you say these things? And my mother's behavior was interesting as I observed this. I'm there for Andrea's support, and I'm shocked, and I'm red, and I'm horrified by what Andrea is saying. But Andrea was saying things like, Mother, why didn't you protect me? And all Mom could do was try to protect Dad. She kept saying to Andrea, you can't take things back. Don't say things like that, Andrea. Don't do that. And it's interesting because a normal woman would turn to their baby girl and say, did he really do that to me? And she'd turn to the father and say, you get out of my life and you get out of her life and don't you ever touch us again. But my mom was not normal. I knew right then my mom was not normal. When Andrea had screamed and yelled at him and got all of her anger out that she had held in for as many years as I can remember, my father got up, he got a funny look on his face, and I was scared for my father. He ran out the door. It was when we lived on Mill Creek Road. I ran out the door behind him, and he walked right over to Skyline High School, and he had literally a wild-eyed, crazy look on his face. And I remember following him. I said, Dad, are you okay? Dad, do you remember doing these things? And he turned to me, and he said, Wanda, and this was not my dad. This is not the normal person that I would talk to every day. He said, Pamela, why would Pamela go with James when she could have come to me? Why would Pamela want sex with James when she could have had sex with me? Now, let me tell you, the reason why Dad was sitting there in my home was because I was helping my father just as he got out of prison. He was put into prison for writing explicit sexual mail to my sister Pamela. Any of us who ever visited home after this knew that my father was literally in love with Pamela. By the way he looked at her, he couldn't hide it. And Pamela's drop dead gorgeous. But she was 14, 15, and 16. I would be telling Pamela, I visited here a couple of times. I can see how he looks at you. Don't ever be alone with him, Pamela. Our father is a sick puppy, this guy. And I was in the early days just trying to warn my sisters from what I was picking up in psychology classes and trying to understand why things were strange with my father. But because I didn't remember anything personally, and because all I had was these little bits and pieces of stuff coming out, nothing really totally made sense. But when I saw this, and plus April's stories years later, and the things that were starting to come up from my mother, and this horrible thing with my dad going to prison, there was no doubt in my mind that my younger sisters needed to be protected. Pamela was, I saw the letters that my father wrote. My mother shared them with me. She almost divorced my dad over that, but some reason my mom stayed with my father, realizing that he was a molested person himself, and she was, I believe, programmed just to stay with my dad no matter what. And there was family members that really truly wanted to reject my mother over that. But to make a long story short, April got these kinds of letters, and Pamela got these letters. It was when those letters hit the DA that my father was, this was the second time. The first time he had had sex with Priscilla, for some reason, they didn't put him in jail. And the second time, even over these letters, he just got put away for 3 years. And those were the years of 1990 to 1993. The first time he had sex with Priscilla in 1980, Priscilla, I remember how she was treated by CFS. She was basically told that it was her fault and that she had done something to bring my father to do this kind of thing to her. Now, she was barely 15, 16, and yet CFS had really done a number on her, and it was a terrible thing that my sister Priscilla went through after that. Her self-esteem went down to nothing, and years after that, I saw what happened to her life.
CFS here in Santa Maria, by the way.
It was, okay, and when this happened in 1980, my dad went to Hawaii, and he wrote me on a little paper bag and said, the first letter was, I didn't know what I did, Wanda. I have no memory, but they tell me that I did this thing, and I was horrified by that. The second letter was totally different. He said, I thought that it was your mom. I'm remembering that I thought that it was your mom, but it ended up being Priscilla. So his stories are a little different, and it was interesting because I knew then in 1980 that my father had a real problem. So as I watched my family, as I studied psychology, and this all unfolded 10 years later, between 1980 and 1990, I was hearing stories about Priscilla remembering things at Vandenberg. April was coming up with her stories. Nancy was still pretty angry over the way the bishop had treated her. And other things started happening. So during this thing that Andrea was lambasting my dad, and dad split and went into this, how come Pamela wouldn't have sex with me stuff, I knew that I was dealing with somebody who obviously had some dissociative personality disorders without question. I personally witnessed as he was saying those things. We came back home and I said, Mom, Dad is in a very, very strange place. And Mom just was shaken to the core. She was just afraid, like a little child, that her one and only support would be taken away again. She begged me not to say anything. Please keep it low key. Let's just, try to get Dad some help. But the truth is, Dad would never get help. And what I found out later about pedophiles is they don't want to get help. They don't honestly think that they've done anything wrong. They think that it's okay to have sex with children, and it's just the rest of the world that's sick and weird, because that's not happening. Okay, so that brings me to my father-in-law, who had sex with, or had a severe molestation. It wasn't full intercourse with the granddaughter. When I brought this out, when I exposed this information, she told me, you will know that it happened because at any of the family gatherings, you will see that he will hug everyone else, but he will not hug me. He will not hug me, because if he tried to hug me, I won't hug him. And his wife, Jane, will always, always ask to take my kids, and I will always politely say no. And you'll see that he will be silent. Well, at the next family gathering, sure enough, I saw this other pedophile who was my father-in-law do exactly that. He hugged everybody in the room, but he wouldn't hug her. And when Jane asked for the kids to babysit them, she politely said no. And the way I found that out was a very interesting story, but it's long, so I won't tell it. The other thing is that when I was I was very young. It was before I was 10 years old. My mother took me in. I was complaining that this is a very strange thing to tell on tape, but I was asked to tell these things, and at the risk of my own personal glamour, I'm going to just tell what happened, and that is that I had a very itchy butt, and I was just horrified by the itching, and I pulled my mom over, and she was very hard on us to ever talk about sex or anything if, anybody, the older brothers asked, they were treated with this horrible masturbation lecture and don't touch yourself, and nobody wanted to talk to my mom. So I had to be really in pain to go to my mother and say anything about my sexual private parts, but my butt was itching, and I noticed that there was something on my butt, and she took a look at it, and she immediately took me into the doctor, and I believe it was either Kara Mitzels or what was the other doctor? Cardi. It was one of the two. And I remember the light shining down on me. I remember them looking at my private parts, and I remember the look on the doctor's face to my mom, and the look on my mom's face back to the doctor, like, don't look at me. I don't know anything about it either, but shut up, And years later, you don't understand what's happening to you as a kid, but years later, I realized that what I had, he put the stingiest stuff on my butt, and it took me weeks to not itch, and it was horrible, just that stuff on my butt. It took me years later to realize that the only way that I could have had that happen was through sexual transmission, that somebody must have molested me, and it must have been sodomy, because I had a transmission of a genetically, what is it called?
Genital wart.
Sexual
It was genital
transmission
wart.
through genital warts. The only way you can get that is a sexual transmission. So that was a pretty horrible thing for me to realize as an adult. That plus the sleeper programming is absolute proof to me. Plus my therapist, who worked with the end of my first marriage, was telling me, Wanda, you're acting as though your father sexually molested you, even if it's emotional. He was always coming to me from age 6 on and saying, you're the big girl, take care of the little kids, do the laundry, mom can't do it, she's pregnant all the time, and you know that mom's crazy, so you got to be my big girl, you got to be the one that helps me. And so from the time I was 6, I was the one, wasn't I? Get your room clean, bring me your laundry. So from the time I was very young, I was not only emotional incested, because I had all the signs and scars, but my therapist told me that there was no doubt in his mind that I had been sexually molested. Okay, I think that's, okay, another thing, another evidence is, while my father had gotten out of prison, they had no place to live, and I took my father and my mother in. I was the one that always rescued everybody in the family, wasn't I, April? They needed help, they came to Waves in my house. We would help everybody, including mom and dad when dad got out of prison after 3 years. During that time, dad was always asking me every week, would you please cut my hair? Would you please cut my hair, Wanda? And it kind of bothered me that my dad would want me to cut his hair. I think, go to the dollar haircut place. Don't ask me to do this, but I would agree to doing it. And I noticed that as an adult woman, that my dad would start to breathe a certain way, and that I would follow in the breathing pattern. And it really irked me out when I realized what that breathing pattern was, that my father had indeed molested me, that it was a sexual breathing pattern, that I was answering back to it at the time that there was this physical intimacy between us. And at a certain point, I looked at my father and I said, Dad, get your own haircuts. I'm out of the haircutting business. And that literally cut my relationship off with my father in any kind of physical, intimate way, because I knew I couldn't even hug him after that without having the creeps. Another thing that was brought up by April was that we were part of something called the Most Dangerous Game. I'll let her talk about that. With my boyfriend, Eric Bianchi. Eric Bianchi did go to the war. He was working for the Secret Service. And I do believe that we were part of the Most Dangerous Game. I remember times on the beach when we did wake up, and I don't remember what happened before that. Another thing is that I got a letter in the mail as an adult woman with Paul H. Dunn, who worked with my brother Paul, the Olympian. And Paul H. Dunn was a high-up person in the Mormon church who was later slandered for lying and publicly put down as an apostle of the church. Paul H. Dunn was who sent me a letter and invited me to be part of the church music committee, which I did for 2.5 years. At that point, for 2.5 years, I went to the church office building. I was given a special badge to be let in an area that only general authorities get let into, and working with some top people. What I actually did there for 2.5 years, who knows? If I am one of these people, who knows? Another thing
You don't remember? You don't have any memory of
Oh,
what
I
you did?
remember that we worked on the music committee, but I was in some very special territory up at the church office building. The only way I got through the church office was with people that looked like mafia, that's frankly. And also, there was an Osmond connection. I was hooked up with the Osmonds. We talked about doing firesides together. The Osmonds, Paul H. Dunn, my brother Paul, me, it's all a weird connection. President Monson. Another thing is that my sister Ellen, when I started questioning some things about UFOs and doing some reading and sending some articles from the internet with her, she thought that was so terrible that I should question about UFOs and about new things that were coming out about possibilities that there might be some strange things going on at the top of the church. She actually said that she felt like she needed to get with Gay, Paul's husband, or Paul's wife, and deliver this information that I was questioning things in the church to none other than President Thomas Monson. Now that is very strange, but I would say that President Monson is definitely a key player in this. April claims that he is. She also claims that Paul H. Dunn was part of the people that was putting together something called the American Church and using the kids in the church that were involved, and he would definitely have been part of this. He was also part of something, a ribbon cutting ceremony with the Osmonds and me. I was there, and I got a creepy feeling with him there at that time. Just something that's unexplainable, but I knew that Paul H. Dunn had something more to do with my past than I would remember. There was just my own feeling that with everything that's happened in my family, if one person remembered something, that would be one thing. If two people remembered some things, that might be another thing. But what I witnessed the day after my mother's death was 3 of my sisters, 2 reliving the trauma of a terrible, terrible ritual that was performed in the Salt Lake Mormon temple. And these sisters all 3 of them tell me that I was there and that I helped rescue them. And after everything that has happened to me, I have no other recourse than to believe my sister April. As crazy as her story sounds, I recommend that anybody that listens to this thing that I'm telling you on this tape, you study MK Ultra documents. You study the Senate House Subcommittee information. You find out what the government has done in institutions, in prisons, with children of sex offenders. And you just put the pieces together and you realize that this happened in my family. And not just one of us are going to tell. All of us are going to tell what happened to us so that the world can put a stop to this terrible traumatization of innocent children.
That's a good, yeah.
You-
One more thing that happened. For about 10 years, I was on the church speaking circuit. Basically, I would go around and some state president or some Relief Society president or some person would call me in the stake and they would say, would you please come and do a fireside? Basically, I had access to every stake in the United States, every area. I had some place to go, sometimes 2 and 3 times a week, somewhere. I was the most sought after speaker anywhere in the United States. On the outside, anything that I was doing had to do with Mormon music. I'm a Mormon recording artist. I have about 10 CDs that I have done. I'm famous in the world of Mormon singing. I'm the first person that they gave the Grammy Award to in the church. It's put out by the listener. It's called the Listener's Choice Award. And so I'm kind of famous for my singing. And I would go around and I would speak and I would make people laugh and cry and do a wonderful presentation about love and everybody obeying the commandments and being happy. And the weird thing after all this is over is realizing that that is what Kathy O'Brien did. She was in the world of country music. And she said that unbeknownst to her waking memory self, the normal self, she was just going around and being a part of all of that was going on at Lampe, Missouri, Branson, and working with all of these people in the entertainment world. But when she remembered everything that happened to her, she knew that she had been involved, including Mormon. She went from being Catholic to Mormon. This woman states that she ran drugs through stake presidencies to Mormon, what's called bishop storehouses, and she would bring the drugs that would need to be stored there. Where else could you hide more beautifully a whole drug ring or pornography ring or anything better than someplace nobody would even think to look at the bishop's storehouses all the way through the world? Now, I don't really know what I was doing for 11 years because everybody said, you were the most sought after person. I never did any advertising. People would just feel to call and they would feel to bring me there. And I would stay there for usually 3 days. After hearing Kathy O'Brien's story, I do not know what the government used me for, but I go like this, with the sleeper programming, with my music ability, with the fact that I was famous, with the fact that people called me all over without me ever soliciting anything. I have to ask the question, what really was I used for? Why was I doing 3 of these a week for a very, very long time? And could I have had anything to do with any of this?
But
Message giving to state presidents, because I saw all of them. I met all of them.
What years was that?
I started doing this around 1987, and I did it, well, about 1986, I started speaking.
This was before or after you got your degree in psychology?
Yes, until about the year 1998. So this was during my singing career. I left my career of psychology and went into my singing career, and my singing career took over. And I have to frankly question, since I was obviously monarch programmed, since I obviously had the genetics and my father being a classic for a Project Paperclip, I was obviously involved in this somehow. What is my question? And this horrifies me. What was I really used for is my question. Was I a Manchurian candidate? Was I some kind of dissociative spy? I'm obviously dissociative. I have to know that. And it's a horrible thought.
Have you done anything to try to uncover the memories of what you were doing all those?
Psychologist.
I have actually become a rapid eye technician, and I have worked with NLP, and the top person, like I said, whose name I cannot divulge, said that there is no doubt that I am a dissociative personality and that I have all the classic triggers for the programming that has been uncovered by Dr. Corey Hammond with the Green Bomb speech. And that's my testimony, and I hope this is of some use to people who are not afraid of the truth.
And you give all this freely of your own free will, without remuneration, without any reason to deviate from the truth?
It's all the truth.
And do you grant permission to play this on television or any other internet media stream?
Yes, I do.
And where did you get your Grammy Award? Where was it actually given to you?
It was actually given at the, it's not a Grammy Award, it's called, it was before the Pearl Awards. It was called the Listener's Choice Award, the very first time that
What city?
They gave it out. In Salt Lake City.
What year?
It's called a Bravanel Hall or Symphony Hall. And it was in the early 90s was when it came out. And by the way, Deseret Book, who put me through this, I got a recording contract with Deseret Book, who literally is owned by the church. And when I started to wake up and remember some of these things and started getting some help, my recording contract was cut off, and that's another story. And there's some very nasty goings on there politically.
All right. Thank you very much, Wanda Lindstom.
You're welcome. One of my sisters, Priscilla, that originally started having some memories, and for her first memories were about Vandenberg Air Force Base. Well, her very first memories were about Dad and being a pedophile, and from the very time she could even remember that he would be forcing oral sex on her. She's the only sister other than Irene that is extremely blonde and very tow-headed, and she and her children have been targets for some very insidious things. And one of the things that happened to Priscilla is that, as I told you about the Mormon Temple incident, she was apparently up to be the next sacrifice. She was supposed to be sacrificed that day, and they had already witnessed some terrible things happening to a baby. They were just about ready to reach for her, and that's when Dawn said, "Not unless you're gonna have to take me too." And she started screaming, and they started screaming. That's when April and I ran in and apparently took them under one arm, and April grabbed the other one and took them under another arm, and we ran like we had little footballs next to us, and apparently we saved my two sisters, Dawn and Priscilla. Well, Dawn was put into the Catholic convent by orders of the Mormon bishop, which is extremely strange. And Priscilla and Dawn, both years later, went into the military, which I think is awfully weird. But they did, and I told you about Dawn's story and how she was asked to be muling drugs. But Priscilla's story is even more interesting. She looked like Private Benjamin. She was at the top, she worked for one of the top people who was third down in the Pentagon and directly to the president. And I asked her what she would be doing working as a secretary or as a top liaison aide for this person high up in the military. And she said, "Oh, well, I translate secret documents." And I said, "You translate secret documents? That's really cool, Priscilla. I mean, you look like $1,000,000. And she did. She looked so beautiful. Well, a couple of years later, I said, "How come you got out of the military?" She says, "Well, my boss raped me." And I said, "Priscilla, did he really?" And she said, "Yes." And I took it through the military court system to try to prove that he did. And they actually voted in his favor. And she says, "I guess you can't, expect justice in the military." And she was pretty broken by this. She ended up telling me about stories while she worked with him of waking up half naked along the freeway and walking and being completely disoriented and having to find a ride and cover up herself and, get a ride back to the base and not knowing what happened to her, having a complete block of memory. And I thought that was a horrible story. And another story is that as she started having children, that she'd had one child that almost got taken from her and inducted into a child molestation ring. And just as she was proving all of this and getting it out to the information to the press, she actually got on record and put it out. And the people were actually caught in a child molestation ring that were trying to take her daughter. And through some miracle, she did get her daughter back before she went to, of all places, Denver, Colorado, which you hear terrible stories about, things that are going on in the name of the New World Order under the Denver, Colorado airport. And to make a long story short, Priscilla has gone through some, now this thing that I just told about with her happened about 5 years ago. And that would have been about in 1998. And she did get her child back. But meanwhile, as I'm trying to put all this together and I'm asking Priscilla, what did you do for this man that raped and molested and did terrible things to you? She says, yes, I decoded secret documents and they were always in the two languages. And I said, well, what do you mean the two languages? She said they were always in Mickey Mouse language or something from Lewis Carroll, something from, what's that person called?
The Cheshire.
The Cheshire Cat, or it would have Mickey Mouse, or it would have something to do with a Lewis Carroll character. And as you'll recall, Lewis Carroll was the one who wrote the Jabberwocky and Alice in Wonderland. To make a long story short, that tied in exactly with April's story. Now, Priscilla and April haven't spoken for years, and so I'm hearing April's story. He was telling me about how Paul H. Dunn was giving us secret codings through Lewis Carroll information, and how Lewis Carroll was a known pedophile. April had done some research and found out that this man, Lewis Carroll, was famous for being a pedophile, actually. And it's interesting that he would have been working directly with people in the military and that kind of information. And he was famous for his backwards talking, everything being reversed and switched and backwards. And to think that that was all a part of this by design. Now we're hearing about the Mickey Mouse phenomenon through Kathy O'Brien's story. It's amazing the correlation here. Kathy O'Brien's story comes out, and guess what she says? She says that she was giving military secret information, and she would approach somebody through both the Wizard of Oz language or also Mickey Mouse language or Lewis Carroll language. So there we go, another tie-in to another separate story that's all got the consistency going on. When I look at somebody's story, I look for the consistency, the things that are making sense, that they're all saying. And you first hear a story like this and it's nuts. The second time you hear it, it gets stranger. But when you hear about 4 or 5, 10, 20 stories that are all the same using the most bizarre stuff, then it starts to make sense. You've got blackouts, all my sisters have had blackouts. You've got that language being talked about, it's all making sense. You've got rapes, you've got, stories of waking up and not knowing where you are. Dawn has had those things happen to her. April's had those things happen to her. And now as I go back, as I'm here in Santa Maria, California, as I go back and as I talk to my old girlfriends, I find out about their stories of their families, of their Mormon families when their father has been taken to prison for child molestation, and how she thought for sure that it was all little girls that slept with their daddies, that was normal. And her name was Roxanne Bradley, and she has told her story, and she has been called crazy. Well, she's not crazy. Roxanne, this is for you, babe. It happened in our family too. I found out, I've uncovered it. And then I've got a girlfriend who did finish her degree, who did go in. She's remembering the cult activity that happened in the church. And this is right from this little town in Santa Maria. Then you've got a book called Mormon Alliance, and in it talks about the complete cult satanic rings that have been going on in this town. They all mention Vandenberg Air Force Base. They all tie in. Then you've got Priscilla, the little toe-headed girl who's got little toe-headed children who are extremely smart. She doesn't have ordinary kids. She has extremely brilliant children. One of them is named Ben. And Ben just recently visited me. Now in Kathy O'Brien's story, she talks about how multi-generational incest victims have visual acuity that is 44 times normal. That is another thing that the military has been really interested in, taken advantage of. Because these children, when it's gone on for generations, they figure out a way of escaping the body, they figure out a way of seeing farther, running faster, figuring out spiritual gifts, all kinds of things come through this generational abuse. Well, it turns out that something came off of my computer. It was so tiny that there was no way I could read it. I had to go get a what do you call it, where you look at it, a magnifying glass to see if there was any way that I could read this. Well, there was no way, but Ben walks in, who was staying with me for a couple of days, trying to find a place to live. And he walks in and he says, you know what's really scary about that? And he lifted it up. He says, I can read this perfectly. And this thing that looks like nothing more than a line, nothing more than a squiggle, he actually read word for word for word. His visual acuity was off the charts. There would be absolutely no way a normal person could read what looked to me like an absolute line. And I looked on it to check it, and sure enough, he had read it word for word. This is Priscilla's children, the children who had been probably abused all her life. And it goes on from one generation to another, to another. And my testimony to you is that you have to believe this. You have to do the research. You have to figure it out. You have to listen to me, because I am telling you the truth. I'm telling you what I have put together over 20 years in my family. If just one person told me this story, I wouldn't believe it. But I have been putting this together for years and years and years. And I've been studying the Mickey Mouse connection. I've been listening to Kathy O'Brien. I've been emailing her. I've been emailing Sue Ford. And their stories are all the same. And what they're doing in the name of religion, in the name of pedophilia, in the name of secret combinations, in the name of religion, it's all boiling down to the military using some very insidious operations to grow a crop of secret spies.